All right, excellent. So we've just started the recording. Thank you, Janet. That was worth everything. And as I was saying to everybody listening, we're proud to be part of the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative, founded by Eben Goodstein at Bard, the Bard Center for the Environment. We're joined by up to 60 people right now, which is fabulous. And our objective, as I was saying a moment ago, is to come up with 3 specific ways that Vermont can move forward to help us solve climate by 2030. So we look forward to starting with Eben Goodstein, who will get us oriented, and then our panelists will get us going, all right? So welcome everybody, and through the magic of Zoom, give me a moment.
At this point, I want to hum the Jeopardy song.
You may do that. Could you do that? A few bars of Jeopardy, please. All right, here we go. Here's our friend. Sorry, Carolyn. All right, off we go.
Solve climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 US states, Puerto Rico, DC, and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact, the US state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the US. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments, starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently, the Chinese and Indians. Government policies have brought these industries to scale, and now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
All right, everybody. So truly inspiring words from Eben Goodstein. And so we're so thankful for his leadership and the leadership of everybody on this call. Let me note to the 65 attendees that you are able to chat to the panelists. We're taking quite a lot of precautions because of this phenomenon of Zoom bombing, but we know a lot of good people are there, and we're looking forward to your feedback. So as some of you have already done, you can go ahead and ask questions, make comments. In particular, when the panelists finish up, then we will be diving into your comments via chat. So I hope that that is a clear enough instruction. I'm going to start by introducing the first of our 3 panelists, who is Jared Duval. I'm proud to have known Jared since he was a leading undergraduate, leading the Sierra Student Coalition, one of the first few movers in the climate movement, led, as so often true of movements, by college students. Jared now lives in the Montpelier area with his family. He's the executive director for the Energy Action Network here in Vermont. He has served as the economic development director at the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. And if you Google his name, Jared Duval, Vermont, you will see a whole set of wonderful parts of his remarkable career. So thankful to welcome Jared, and in about 10 minutes or so, he's going to give us a really good statewide view of how Vermont can move forward based on his expertise and his colleagues, and then we'll proceed from there. Jared, you ready to go?
Yeah,
awesome.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Thank you for your friendship and mentorship over the years, and your leadership at Middlebury and beyond has been a real inspiration to me for a long time. So I'm really glad to be here with you and with everyone who's joining the webinar and the fellow panelists who I'm looking forward to hearing from and being in discussion with. So I want to say up front that while our focus right now is rightly and primarily on the public health emergency that the COVID-19 pandemic presents, we also know that the climate crisis is not going away. And if our government's delayed and inadequate response to the coronavirus has taught us anything, as Eben alluded to in his opening video, it is the importance of listening to experts, public health officials, climate scientists, and proactively acting on the best available evidence. Because once we are in the realm of having to react to a fast unfolding situation that's somewhat already beyond our control because we refused to, or we ignored the evidence and expertise early on, then the options that we have in front of us become really limited. They become costly, they become painful, and they become not as effective as if we acted early on proactively. I'm reminded of what Dr. Anthony Fauci said recently when he said, "You are always behind where you think you are." And that statement applies as equally to the climate crisis as it does to the pandemic. We know that the amount of climate destabilization that is already baked into our physical systems due to high concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions is dangerously high. And one hope that I have, if there is a silver lining or one silver lining that can come from our current challenge, is that with the increased public familiarity with and the understanding of concepts like exponential growth, like feedback loops, systemic risk, delayed impacts, that people will become more comfortable with and ready to demand taking proactive and preventative action, not just regarding public health, as is increasingly necessary, but also regarding the climate crisis and our energy future. One thing that I really appreciate about this Solve Climate by 2030 effort is the focus on state and local action, because it is going to take action at all levels of government and society to respond to the climate crisis effectively. I kind of think of it as an old-fashioned barn raising where we all have a part to play. And of course, that will look different in different places because different states have different sources of climate pollution, and therefore different challenges and opportunities for how we can be part of the solution. So that's where I want to start, is setting some context for Vermont. And I'll just note that the Energy Action Network, which I direct, is an organization that serves a diverse, broad network of members and public partners, over 200 organizations and businesses and public agencies and departments across Vermont. And one of the things that we do on behalf of our network is to try to ground and advance state energy and climate conversations with data and evidence so that we can enable more effective progress towards Vermont's energy goals and climate commitments, and do so in a way that is aligned with a mission that's not just about the numbers, but is about creating a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. And those words all matter: just, thriving, and sustainable. The way that we share analysis and try to ground our statewide energy and climate conversation in data and evidence primarily happens through an annual progress report that we publish every year. The most recent one was just published last month and is available at eanvt.org. The slide you see right now is the cover image of that report. If you can go to the second slide. One thing that is important to know about Vermont is that, unlike the US as a whole and unlike some other states, where our climate pollution comes from, it's very different. So over 70% of Vermont's climate pollution is the result, you see in the green and the orange, is the result of how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings, primarily from our use of fossil fuel vehicles and heating systems. And as you'll see in a little bit, 80% of the energy costs that Vermonters face are from transportation and heating, with an even greater energy cost burden for low-income Vermonters and those living in more rural areas. Globally and nationally, we are so focused on the important issue of how we generate electricity, the very important issue: solar, wind, hydro, conversations about the role of nuclear, etc., that we can sometimes miss the obvious point here in Vermont, which is that when it comes to pollution and cost, the electricity sector is dwarfed by transportation and heating. Also, our electricity sector here is relatively low emitting. Our biggest challenges and opportunities here in Vermont, whether it's for cost-effective emissions reduction and for energy cost savings for Vermonters, are primarily about moving beyond fossil-fueled heating and transportation, taking advantage of our low-carbon, ever decreasing pollution in our electricity sector. So while we can and must still get emissions reduction from our electricity sector, we should not forget that it is already 60% renewable in Vermont and over 90% carbon free, as measured in compliance with the state's renewable energy standard. For the wonks participating on the call, I'll note that that is post-rec accounting, renewable energy certificates. But no matter how you measure it, pre-rec, post-rec, in-state supply, or total electricity versus in versus out-of-state electricity consumption, no matter how you measure it, Vermont either has the lowest or one of a small handful of the lowest emitting electricity sectors of any state in the country. And again, while we can do more to decarbonize that sector, we really need to focus now on getting off of fossil fuel for how we get around and heat our buildings as well. So if you can go to the next slide, you see here across those three energy sectors, if we take a comprehensive view, where is our energy use, where do our emissions come from, and where are the costs? And they're, again, primarily located in those thermal and transportation sectors. If you can go to the next slide, this shows our statewide greenhouse gas emissions as of 2016, the most recent year for which we have comprehensive data. And you see here that, again, over 70% of our emissions come from transportation and heating. And the one sector that we are seeing real and durable declines in climate pollution from is electricity. So you see here, 8% of our statewide emissions in 2016 were from the electricity sector. We don't have full data yet for 2018, but we do have the data for the electricity sector. And what that shows is that it's likely now about 2% of our statewide emissions. And that's the result of policy. The renewable energy standard that the Vermont legislature passed in 2015 has led within 3 years to an over 80% reduction in emissions from our electricity sector. The challenge is that we have not moved the needle in a durable way on the two big bars on the left in transportation and thermal. And that has real costs. We partnered this year with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to do an economic impact analysis of energy use in Vermont. And one of the things that we found is over the last decade, on average, Vermonters spend about $2 billion a year on fossil fuels for transportation and heating. And that has massive implications, not just for our climate pollution, which is the highest per capita of any New England state, higher also than New York per capita, higher also than Quebec per capita, but that also has implications for our state economy. And at a time when we're now looking ahead to economic recovery, local resilience, the importance of creating new and stable jobs here in Vermont, as we're experiencing increasing unemployment, we need to end our fossil fuel use as quickly as possible. So if you go to the next slide, it shows why. When we spend that $2 billion a year on fossil fuels, $1.5 billion of it drains right out of the state economy. On average, it varies, but on average, about 75% leaves the state. In contrast, all of the investments we can make in efficiency or in heating or getting around with efficient electricity or with sustainable wood heat keep far more dollars local, creating and supporting jobs for our neighbors, leaving us less vulnerable to long international supply chains and the volatility in the oil and gas markets. We've understood the benefits of buy local in our agricultural sector for a long time now, in how we purchase food. And the same is true when it comes to energy. Specifically, the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development estimates that while only 25 cents of every dollar spent on fossil fuels stays in Vermont, about 60 cents of every dollar invested in weatherization, 62 cents of every dollar we spend on electricity, and 80 cents that we spend on wood heating stays here in Vermont. So that's about the kind of macro economy, redirecting our energy spending to support our neighbors and strengthen and make more resilient the Vermont economy. But there's also an important story here about potential savings for Vermont consumers. If you can go to the next slide, John, this shows some price comparisons for different ways that you can get around or heat your home or building. So on the top left, we see diesel in gray and gasoline in orange, and the equivalent cost of powering an electric vehicle in green. If you look in the lower right, that compares different ways to heat our homes and buildings, with the two highest cost historically and most volatile, which we're seeing now. We saw a big drop, then we saw a 25% increase, the largest in history, in the price of oil. Over time, the highest cost and most volatile prices have been for diesel and gasoline, and for propane and fuel oil. So when we can get down to those flatter, lower cost, more price stable curves for electricity and local sustainable wood, it also can lead to significant savings for Vermonters. Of course, the challenge is that to be able to take advantage of that lower cost electricity or wood heat, there's often the need to make an upfront investment to change your vehicle or your heating system. And that's where policy comes in. While solar, wind, and hydro electricity generation have been around for decades, those solutions for how we get around and heat our homes and buildings more efficiently and without fossil fuels are newer to a lot of Vermonters. A decade ago, there were fewer than 100 electric vehicles in Vermont. There were basically no cold climate heat pumps in Vermont. But as of last year, we're over 3,500 EVs registered in the state, over 17,000 cold climate heat pump systems, over 11,000 heat pump water heaters. And those numbers could be, they're growing every year, and they could be the beginnings of a wholesale market transformation if we pair with the declining costs and the improving technology, a policy framework that sends market signals and creates requirements to help them take off, as we did with the growth of solar PV in Vermont and many other states have done. If you look at the next slide, it compares Vermont to our policy and regulatory framework to that of other states. And it also includes our neighbor to the north, the province of Quebec. We have only set policies and regulations to require emissions reduction from that small blue bar to represent our electricity sector. And the orange and the green, in terms of our climate pollution from heating and transportation, are unregulated. They do not have the same policy framework that other places like Quebec and California have put in place. So the point here is that while Vermont has experience with very successful policy in terms of our electricity generation sector, in terms of electric efficiency through our statewide efficiency utility, Efficiency Vermont, we have not been successful yet with pollution reduction policies and regulations for the transportation and heating sectors, where most of our challenge is. And this stands in contrast to many other places around the world, including here, as you see in the graph, Quebec and California. So that's why in this year's annual progress report, we decided to include policy case studies from across the world, particularly ones that would shine a light on what we can do in the transportation and thermal sectors. We found that Norway really stood out for driving down emissions from their transportation sector. They did so by, if you go to the next slide, they passed a law requiring that all passenger vehicles sold after 2025 be zero emissions, effectively banning the sale of new fossil fueled passenger vehicles beyond 2025. In the meantime, between now and then, they've put a fee on the purchase of new fossil fueled vehicles to account for, you'll appreciate this, John, as an economist, to account for the social and environmental cost of the pollution that they create. And then they've used that revenue to direct incentives for the more electric vehicles. Together, as you can see from this graph, these and other policies have led to a point where the majority of new vehicle sales in Norway, which I'll also just note is a similar climate. This isn't like a fair weather flat state. It's a cold mountainous country. But the majority of their new vehicle sales as of 2018 are electric, and they're driving their fossil fuel vehicles down to zero. I want to note that the approach of setting a future date certain past which old and dangerous technologies that are hazardous to human health and the environment will be banned, as Norway has done with their phase out of fossil fuel vehicles by 2025. That's not new. The United States has taken a similar approach with substances like, we'll remember, like lead and asbestos. The difference is that fossil fueled vehicles, heating systems, and other pieces of equipment are not just detrimental to human health, they're destabilizing the entire climate upon which we depend. I think that while this is a complex issue, it's also really quite simple. Fossil fuels are the problem, and each of us has to do what we can to stop creating new demand for them, especially because the electric and renewable alternatives are proven, ready, and available. I think the lesson here, though, is that it's important to focus on the fuel, but the fuel is not enough. It's also about the equipment, the vehicles and the heating systems, and intervening at that point of purchase when you can avoid locking in a decade of fossil fuel use with vehicles, or 2 or 3 decades with the average life of a heating system. I'll just close by saying that most Vermonters I know don't like using gasoline or diesel for their car, or fuel oil or propane to heat their homes. They just do so because that's the vehicle they have or the heating system that was in the house when they moved there. So that's why I think we need to do more as a state to focus on that point of purchase and to extend a successful policy and regulatory framework beyond the electricity sector to the transportation and heating sectors, and to make sure that we have a framework that focuses on equity as we do all of that. Because the danger is that if you just get a bunch of middle and upper income Vermonters switching to electric vehicles and efficient electric heating, et cetera, they're going to benefit a lot from the cost savings over time, but we could leave exposed to stranded assets, to high cost fossil fuel vehicles and equipment, our most vulnerable neighbors. So I don't want to submit a specific policy, but overall, I would say the area of focus needs to be, how do we extend a policy and regulatory framework comprehensively beyond the electricity sector to focus on transportation and thermal through the lens and framework of equity. I'll save anything further until later.
Jared, thank you. That was fantastic. And were we in a pre-COVID-19 environment, we would be all together here in the Franklin Environmental Center at Hillcrest at Middlebury. And I don't doubt there would be some applause because that was really outstanding. Thank you. Yeah, we'll all do that. It's fantastic to know that the Energy Action Network is doing what it does. I know you collaborate with so many people, provide material. I would hope that all attendees can take a look online at this latest report, full of helpful information. I look forward to looking at policies you have found elsewhere. What a good way to think about the sort of information spillovers from other people. I'm delighted to introduce our next panelist now, Carolyn Finney, who will speak to the issues that you suggested in the very end in terms of justice and inclusion and so forth. And Carolyn is a fellow Middlebury faculty member, a scholar in residence, technically. Like Jared, I encourage you to read her bio online because you will be blown away. She speaks of herself as a storyteller, author, a cultural geographer. She traveled through Africa and Asia, Nepal, returned to school after a 15-year absence. I love that kind of stuff, Carolyn. Did a BA.
Me too.
An MA, and eventually a PhD, has been on the faculty at Wellesley, UC Berkeley, University of Kentucky, and we're now lucky to have her at Middlebury, I hope for a good amount of time. Her well-regarded book by the UNC Press is Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, an idea which she certainly embodies. Carolyn, it's a joy to welcome you to this panel. I know you know Vermont well. You've been on boards here and you're now living here, and it's a place that has been in maybe a second or at least a third home for quite a while. So we look forward to hearing your perspective on this whole idea of making sure that everybody is part of the conversation from day one, and also how that applies to Vermont. So welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you, John. What an introduction. Yeah, I have my notes and I'm probably not even going to pay any attention to them. Thank you for having me be part of the panel. And Jared, thank you, because actually that was really helpful for me. So it's funny, John, that you introduced me as saying Carolyn's very familiar with Vermont, because literally the first line in my notes is, I don't really know Vermont very well because I haven't lived here very long. Well, both things are true, right? So I've probably been coming here for the better part of 10, 15 years because I've been involved with different, primarily the Center for Whole Communities, different nonprofits, but also the University of Vermont and the Rubenstein School. So I come in for brief periods to have these conversations in more extensive fashion. But I only moved here since August. And so it's really different actually when you live in a place. And so I'm really conscious about my limitations at this point to talk about what's specifically happening in this place. But I feel like I can really talk about more broadly the questions of justice, how we define that, what that looks like when we have this conversation. I hope I can do that. It's a little bit what I want to do with my, my 10 minutes. It's funny, when I looked at the title on the website, the virtual teach-in on climate solutions and justice, and what I went, oh, justice, that's how I can come into the conversation. It's funny, it's not what I thought of when I looked at climate solutions. So I want to come back to that later, because I think that actually might hold true for some people about how they think about climate and climate solutions as it's been put. So I also want to go back to what Evan Goodstein was saying in the beginning too, a couple of his comments. What we do locally will change the future, but it was the other comment he said, we saw this coming. What happens when you ignore science? So in thinking about COVID-19, I always like to operate from where we are. And I think this moment actually reveals a lot of things about our conversation, about climate solutions, about how we might be thinking about moving forward, and most certainly the question of justice. So I was thinking of a couple of things. Somebody had sent me a article, I guess ProPublica had put out a graph and some imagery about the air pollution in Italy. And noticing that from February 14th to around March 8th, smog had dropped. So during the time in Italy where everybody's sheltering in place, you could suddenly see that there was less air pollution in the air. So kind of just want to throw that out there. So we're not on the streets, so things seem a little different. But in terms of my interest around justice, what has gotten my conversation is, gotten my attention is a couple of issues. There was a New York Times article called Social Distancing is a Privilege. And really starting to understand the role of race and class and other forms of difference in informing how people are affected by COVID-19, as well as their ability to respond to it. So part of the myth that's been kind of flying, I call it a myth, that's been kind of out there is, it's not a myth actually. The idea that this virus can impact anyone. Actually, the virus ain't paying any attention to the color of your skin, how much money you make, so on and so forth. But what we understand, and this is where in practice, is that people's ability to respond to it, how it impacts them, that's actually completely different. And one of the, I guess a small study was done in Milwaukee to really understand that, where African Americans make up something like 26% of that population, but something like 81% of the deaths due to the coronavirus have been African American. The other article that I wanted to, somebody had sent me, was about, more recently we're being asked to create our own masks to wear on our face and to go out in public, right? So everybody can do that. We don't want to be taking the masks the healthcare workers want. But this one article pointed to how many people of color are not going to wear homemade masks. One Black man who's an educator out of Columbus, Ohio, his quote was, "I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive." And to understand that for many Black and Latinx people, to wear a bandana, to wear a homemade mask, going out in public, we have a history of what that means here, for better or for worse, and they don't feel safe doing that. So they actually have to make a choice. Do I want to be safe against the virus, or do I want to be safe against police or anybody else who might misinterpret who I am because as a brown person, I have this mask across my face? And so for me, these things, the parallels to climate and the things that are happening, they're so obvious to me, both about what it means in terms of bringing difference to the table and how we see certain people and how certain people are able to engage, how we respond, right? So going back to Evan Goodstein's quote, we saw this coming, what happens when you ignore science, I absolutely agree with, and what happens when you ignore history? That's what I would want to add, right? One of the privileges that I have in my work is that while I'm new to Vermont, I'm not new to the conversation, and I spend most of my time over the last 5 and 6 years in particular going around the country having this conversation with people around difference, diversity, inclusion, inequity, power, privilege, as it relates to environment broadly defined. And that has expanded into the climate change conversation for people. And so there's some things that I wanted to sort of, I come just throwing them into the conversation around that. I have to look back at my notes here to make sure I'm covering everything. I wrote, climate change does not honor borders, and we know that, just like we've seen with COVID-19, right, that it can impact everywhere, but doesn't impact everyone in the same way. Vermont is part of a larger system, and while local and statewide focus is important, how do we retain and build upon our relationship to the larger context? I'm not saying we're not doing that. I totally get why we're focused on state and local, and I'm absolutely down with that's what we need to do. And climate change ain't paying attention to the borders, right? Inequality doesn't pay any attention to that. All those things are unique to our geography, but how do we still think of that larger context and what's going on? Because legislation gets passed at the national level and it's going to impact here. So what does that mean in terms of who our allies are and how we're able to show up, right, in those spaces? To consider that. I wrote, how do coalitions across state lines serve our individual and collective intentions and our goals? What do we mean when we say justice in the context of climate work? Like, really, what do we mean? I'm willing to bet that how many people, 60 plus people are on this call, we all aren't thinking the same thing around that. And that's really, for me, important for us to decide what that is. So if we're talking about state legislation, if we're talking about policy, if we're talking about actual practices about how we engage people. So what do we mean by justice? Because are we talking about economic inequality? Are we talking about, and Jared, I'm sure that you have thought about this, but one of the things that popped out at me, the idea, which I didn't know about Vermont, you know, in terms of electricity and in terms of, you know, heat and what we use in our homes. Well, what if we're renters? I'm a renter, so really I have no control over what my landlord does. And actually, so what's going to be done in terms of what's my motivation to participate? I mean, of course, I, Carolyn Finney, want to participate, but really, how many people in the state rent, you know, compared to how many people have second homes? You know, so what does it look like? And I'm not making people who have second homes bad people. I'm just saying there's going to be inequality there in terms of also who has access to the conversation and who has power to say, well, you know what, I have 2 homes or I have a home here. So I have greater, you know, I should have greater ability to have my needs actually attended to. And actually how many, I know this is a rural state and a lot of people own cars. Actually, I don't yet. And when it has me thinking of, because I have the ability to actually buy a car, how many people here don't own cars? So where are they in the conversation in terms of what they need and what they might be thinking about? I wrote, okay, I've got here, how we take stock. What is made visible? What is made invisible? Who is made invisible? Who gets missed in terms of what we don't see? So I was thinking about a number of years ago, I've lived in 19 places since I was 19, 17 of them being around the country. And there's some interesting commonalities about you know, what we see and who we see and what we don't see. And for the year that I spent living in Florida in about 2006, and in conversations with people around environmental issues, particularly the national parks down there, the Everglades, one of the, you know, and they wanted to reach out to diverse communities and have them engage and have them feel some sense of ownership. But one of the things that was really interesting, coming from a predominantly white staff at that time at Everglades National Park, was the myth that Black and brown people don't care. You had a significant African-American and Latinx community in Miami. It's an hour away from the parks, and they don't care about the environment as much. And I would always say, well, you know, if you drive around Southern Florida, which I did, the Everglades, the canals, they all spread out. What you see every day are Black and brown people fishing. And when I said that, someone actually said, well, that doesn't count. So it has made me think over and over, who is visible, what is visible, and how it changes the conversation around any table around climate change in terms of how people see and understand their world and what they prioritize as being important. And I know we all know this. And I'm really interested how we continue to integrate this, not as something extra that we do over here and justice, but actually justice becomes this thoroughly, it brings greater complexity to the conversation. One of the things that I hear often around climate change in these conversations is, well, it's not going to matter if we can't drink the water and we can't breathe the air. And it's often used as a way to say, look, we'll deal with that later. Let's just fix the air and fix the water and fix the land. And of course, it gets a rise out of me every time because I say, well, that's ignoring history. Because really, for me, what we're actually talking about is a web of relationships, not just relationships to non-human nature, the water, the air, because part of that for me is embedded in this conversation about climate, but to each other. And so what are we perpetuating in terms of power dynamics and relationships and language? Everything from who we represent and who gets to be up front and be involved to, the way we use our language around who's marginalized, what becomes marginalized in the conversation, which then also keeps perpetuating this. How is this a moment and an opportunity for us to do the much harder work of examining everything that we do at this moment, so that going forward, it isn't only about the climate. It's actually really the way we've engaged these challenges that we have in front of us and how we're willing to actually confront things we, in my opinion, haven't really confronted well in the last 300 or 400 years. Yeah, I'm getting worked up and I can't stand up because at this point I'd be like, yes, and I have to sit here. Okay, so what do we prioritize? Who gets to participate? The vision. So I was looking up, the definition of solutions, which I thought is, I like to do that sort of thing. That just makes me kind of nerdy. But I looked up the definition, one of the definitions of solutions. I wrote it down here, and I want to make sure I get it as I read it. Sorry. I wrote all over my notes again. Solutions. I can't find what I wrote, but it was something to the effect of that solutions, that the definition of a solution. So sorry, and it's getting dark in my apartment and I can't see. But the definition of solution is one solving a problem, but the or, and it said or, learning how to deal with a difficult situation. And actually, I feel that latter piece, learning how to deal or relate to a difficult situation, is much more expansive and actually opens up to us in creating a vision, really looking at what is difficult. What does that mean in terms of all the layers and the complexity that's in there, instead of going right to the solution? Because, it's as though we're asking ourselves to cut through to the solution. And I think for a number of people, that makes a lot of people nervous. It makes me nervous because it means I want to get there too, but I don't want to get there the same way we've always gotten there, because a lot of people are going to lose. A lot of people, because you know what, they've already lost, right? Especially if they're not even part of that visioning making process. So what does that mean in terms of what we need to do and the more work that we put on the table for us? So I recently joined the board in Vermont of the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And because of COVID-19, I haven't actually been at a meeting yet. And on Monday, we're gonna have our first virtual meeting that's gonna focus on diversity and inclusion. But when I, back in January, joined the board, I got an email from a woman I don't think I've ever met, but she had seen me talk and she really wanted me to understand something called Act 250. And, I needed to understand really what that's about. So I sort of looked it up about development, and she was really worried that, Vermonters, as she put it, were going to lose their right to participate in making decisions about development and land. And since I talk about participation, I need to know about that, and so I can step up, and it was great that she was letting me know. So then it made me think of, so who, when we say Vermonters, who are we talking about? You know, what does that mean, Vermonters? I mean, there's an idea that pops into my head, and it's not a very inclusive idea of what that means. In terms of Vermonters are very diverse, actually, but it's not usually how outside of the state people describe Vermonters. It's interesting, but within the state, I can see that it's incredibly diverse in multiple ways. So what does that mean in terms of, again, priorities, languaging, participation, representation of people and different people's perspectives and point of view as we think about energy and other issues related to climate change. I wrote here, I think I said this, we're focused on solutions, and I get it, but sometimes that focus can unintentionally recreate existing power dynamics and frameworks that exclude, deny, dismiss, not just people, but also places and flora and fauna, right? So it's not just about people, ideas that could potentially be, and also ideas that could potentially be game changers. And how do we use these stories that, you know, that they can become rallying cries to motivate, but also how can they remain fluid? Because we don't know what we don't know. So how is there room for that to happen? I think we can actually develop a practice around that if we haven't already, around emergence. It doesn't, you know, we don't know what we don't know. And if we're going to pay attention to scientists, and I think we should absolutely, and scientists are always discovering and rediscovering new things every day, but there's also a lot of other kinds of knowledge we can be paying attention to as well. And how do we make space for that? What places of power are we willing to relinquish? So when I'm thinking about building allies, you know, let's say even just within the state of Vermont, right? We want to work across difference. We want to recognize different ways of knowing and being in place and thinking about what climate change actually means and how it's impacted people's lives. There are people who already have some knowledge about that. They may not be scientists, but they are actually engaged because they have a sense of history about place and who they are and their communities and how they deal. And they may very well want to be engaged. There's always this talk of limited funds going to certain organizations, often organizations who have political access, who know the language, who know how to get engaged, which means the same people tend to get funneled right in, get that funding to help them do what it is they need to do. How do we change that? You know, so funding that is available goes to some new potential organizations that are organized at the grassroots level with communities and individuals that we don't usually see at the table. And it gives them a chance to actually create their own table and then build an allyship with existing organizations that have been here for a long time, who know how the system works, and is willing to actually relinquish some of that space. I always say building relationships and not outreach. People know I say that, and creating a relational voice, not a universalizing voice. So, wow, you know, it's so seductive actually to come up with that soundbite, with that universal thing. We're all in this together. We may be, but we all ain't sitting at the same table in the same way in the same part of the ship. We aren't. We are not. The ship we may all be in, but it looks different depending on where you are. So I'm interested in, you know, that takes more work. So how are we going to do that? Now have a universalizing voice. A voice that actually is relational, that sees my relationship to you and vice versa, and understands that actually we have the capacity to do it. We just have to figure out and be willing to be equally as motivated to figure out what that is. And therefore also create space for emergence, right, for those new ideas. The last thing I want to say, it's not the last thing I want to say, but it's the last thing I'm going to say. I wrote here, be here now. And I said, what I mean by this is, yes, by all means, consider future projections and use that as a way to motivate and choose best practices as, you know, in terms of best ways of moving forward. But we must be willing to pull the carpet back and look at all the things we avoid that need repair, right? I wrote, our history is built on hundreds of years of funky behavior to non-human nature as well as each other's. How do we start to unpack that? That has never changed. That work is always there. That's one of the things I think the COVID-19 pandemic reveals and reminds us. the similarities, the ways in which our, some of our leadership is looking at climate change or not looking at it, the same ways with COVID-19. How are we going to do that differently? How do we think of it not as a solution, but actually, I don't know, it's almost like as a revolution in a way of thinking. We're thinking about it in terms of relationship and it's something fluid and ongoing. ... I think I talked 10 minutes. I don't want to go too long.
Perfect. Thank you, Carolyn. And
Yeah.
I'm just so appreciative. This last point, the promise of revolutionary thinking. I think many faculty struggle with this right now. We can't keep teaching business as usual. And by that, I mean the way we've talked about problems. But for all of us, it's uncharted territory. I think of our wonderful colleague, Dan Suarez, who's doing that now.
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, please.
No, I want to say, I think I've been having this conversation with, over the last few weeks, from my apartment with people all over who call us saying, we have to be thinking about solutions. What are we going to do? We got to stay on top of it. We got to produce. Yeah. And I said, well, one of the things right now that some of us are afforded, some of us, a lot of us aren't, is a time to sort of reflect, to witness, to listen, right? Because I'm actually interested in my own authentic responses that I can really show up. The fact of the matter is, we're in the middle of this thing, and it could change tonight. I try to only look at the news once a day, but I haven't been able to stick to that. But when I do, to say like, oh my God, since this morning this has happened, to really think about this moment. If nothing else, it's calling us to a revolutionary way of thinking. Yeah. And it's hard.
Yeah.
And we all have the skill set that we do and this privilege, and we're in this place to do it. Well, right. So for me, that's the work.
Yeah, thanks. I might add, as we transition to Fran, and the transition will be wonderful, I'm quite certain. I'm very taken by what you said on solutions. For a long time, I was very fascinated by solutions, and I realized it was missing nuance, to put it mildly. This definition you came up with is fascinating. The second part, learning how to deal with the difficult situation.
That's actually, John, when I looked it up online, that's what it said.
I love that. Yeah. I just picked up the biography of Ella Baker, and this was her leadership. Many of you know she was not only the leader of SLCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, but then the founder of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the great leaders of the 20th century. And for her, the process was really the solution. It was figuring around things, and she had this wonderful way of bringing people into meetings who might be in the back, and she could tell by body language they wanted to say something. We need that at the state level somehow.
Yes.
So I think the way you think about solutions in the context of this panel couldn't be better.
Yeah.
So thank you. Fran, we are dying to hear from you now, and there's a wonderful way to introduce you, not only as an incredible local leader, and again, I get to cheat and look online, and the leadership that you have taken with the Vermont Home Energy Challenge in the years past, Weybridge being the first town to complete that, working so closely with the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network. You were the co-founder of a group that I'm very fond of and close to, Vision Vermont. You and Spence, your husband and partner in crime, have been really role models for so many of us for how to lead from below and indeed above too. So, and knowing you've spent time in Norway, which Jared's final slide featured, and that you've thought a lot about the justice issues, at the very least with Vision for Vermont, is pretty exciting too. So with that, we're going to bring you in as the speaker, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you, Fran, for being here.
Thank you, John, and thank you for everyone who joined today. It's such a weird transition for me. Less than a month ago, I was downstairs in this building giving a presentation on a trip that my husband and I took to the Nordic countries. And there was an audience, and we got feedback, and people were laughing, and we could tell if we were having an impact. But here we are. Here I am, and I'm looking at this green light here. So, but I want to shift the conversation a little bit to talk about what one person can do, one motivated person can do at the grassroots, having the ability to bring together neighbors and coalesce around this particular issue. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I want to tell how I got into this whole climate crisis work. I was an early childhood educator for most of my career. I worked with 3 to 5 year olds, and I have a special place in my heart for young children. But about 13 years ago, I learned that I was about to become a grandparent for the first time. So I decided to take early retirement to help with the childcare for these children who were coming. And I also found myself thinking about their future. And I would look at those innocent faces and say to myself, what have we left these children? And the children that I taught and all the other children around us. And not to forget the plants and animals and the environment that we were trashing. So this motivated me to stop just wallowing in despair and thinking there's nothing I can do. This problem is way too big for me. And so I spent a lot of time on other issues like the peace movement and early childhood, equity for young children and so on. But this just shifted my whole focus. So the first thing that we did was to build a net zero house and try to take care of a smaller house and sort of take care of our own carbon footprint as much as we could. And that was something I realized, and not everybody can do, but we tried to use it as an opportunity to bring people in for tours and so on, and spread the word about, well, this is possible. You can take steps to reduce your carbon footprint with your heating and your energy use. And then I said, okay, so there has to be something else I can do. So I looked around my town of Weybridge, which is 800 people. And I said, we don't have an energy committee. Why not? And I kept asking. And finally I said, well, and people are busy, so I'm going to do this. And so I got some people together and we formed the first energy committee in Weybridge. And we kind of didn't know what we were doing, but we just thought, well, other energy committees have done this, so we can follow along. So the first thing we really tackled was this energy efficiency question about helping people to weatherize their homes. And we were trained by Efficiency Vermont, and we entered this competition, and we went to 55 homes, and we helped educate people. This is how you get the money, this is where you get the contractor, and so on. This is where you get the incentives. And it was really successful. And then we also weatherized our municipal building, our garage. And we were we worked very hard to get people aware of the weatherization assistance program, which is something that I really feel is important for people who can't afford a loan, or they don't have credit, or they're renters. This is a program that's also for landlords. So we're constantly thinking about how to get that word out to people, but it's hard. It's a great program because it hires unemployed people, trains them, and makes them into a team, and then they go to homes, and it's free. The only thing is the waiting list is around between 1 and 2 years. So obviously we're not doing that job. So the next thing that our committee worked on was recycling and composting. And because now we have this universal recycling, and you can't put food scraps into your compost anymore. So Weybridge really tucked into this, and we found that this was something that it empowered people, and they're very proud of it. We also worked on transportation. That was much tougher. We were trying to get people to make a behavior shift there, and how do you do that? And we're still struggling with that. How do you get people out of single vehicle occupancy, or to use? We don't have a bus through Weybridge, so this is a struggle for us. And at the same time that this was all going on, I realized that the statewide energy policy was also very, very important, because it's fine what people do, 800 people in a little town, but what's going on in a bigger world. So I began to partner with Vermont Natural Resources Council, Efficiency Vermont, VPIRG, and became a volunteer. And so when they needed somebody to go to the State House, you know, they would invite people, I would show up. And I learned so much that way. And I also worked with our legislature and our local legislators and partnered with them. And then about 5 years ago, I was invited to come to Middlebury College and meet with the Sunday Night Environmental Group, which is a group that John Isham was kind of the stimulus for in one of his classes about 16 years ago. But these students have met every Sunday night since then. And they invited me to come and see what they were doing. And so I never left. I'm always there. Every Sunday night I'm there. And I think some of the SNEG students are on here, and I hope that you're listening. They motivate me. They make me feel, their energy is incredible. And it's great to see the work that the students have done on divestment and then Energy 2028. And also we're now working on Vermont state policy. So I'm sort of the informal liaison between that group of students and the wider community, because I love making connections for people. And too much of the time we've had this one group at the college doing amazing things. We have people in the community doing amazing things, but it never seems to meet. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was the Vision for Vermont project, which has been going on for about 3 years. And we have been assembling Vermonters to talk about what is your vision for Vermont? How can we have an inclusive vision and goals and make our goals for a more just society? And then once you have the vision, you start moving there. So this was a great collaboration between the college, Middlebury College, and then people all over Vermont. So that's kind of my involvement. I mean, there's other things that I've done, but those are things that have really meant a lot to me. And sometimes I wonder if I'm just too scattershot and I'm trying to do too many things. And so not everybody has the time. I'm retired. I'm able to do this. My grandchildren are now in school. I feel it's my moral obligation, but I also, it makes me feel as if I'm not wasting the last productive years of my life. So we were asked to talk about targets for carbon reduction in Vermont. And as I guess you've gotten the idea, energy efficiency is really important. And I just wanted to say that everybody wants this in Vermont. You don't have to fight with people to say, would you like to weatherize your home? Would you like to have a more efficient car? Would you like to have a better heating options? People want this. So why not start with this, fund it more robustly? Everybody in Vermont should have access to this, including renters, including people who are homeless. You know, everybody needs a safe and decent place to live. So there's other things. I support renewable energy. I'm always interested in that. I think it's really important. From my visit to Denmark last fall, we learned that the local support for energy installations is much more important than what we seem to understand here in Vermont. And that if you start at the local level and you ask people, what kind of renewable energy installation should we have? Where should we put it? How are we going to pay for it? Who's going to own it? Can anybody who lives in this town have a share? And then you move forward, and then you find someone to work with you, rather than from the top down, which is the way it seems to be going, where a developer will come in, lots of money, the town instantly says, oh, well, not here, we don't want to hear, all the money's going out of Vermont. So local support for renewable energy. I think transportation is really important. Something we haven't talked about here much is Vermont's forests and agricultural lands, and the importance of keeping our forests and augmenting them for carbon sequestration and wildlife protection. And then it all comes down, in my mind, to climate justice. That has to be the platform for everything we do. If we're not doing that, then we're not bringing everybody along and into the circle, then we're not going to succeed, because fairness, to me, fairness leads to consensus. And if everybody's in the middle of the circle and feels that he or she has a place, then we're going to move forward. As long as I think Jared said, as long as it's only rich people who have, can afford the electric car or the fancy heating system and so on, that's not going to get us anywhere. So that's where the state of Vermont has to come in. That's where tax policies have to change. That's where we have to, the political structure has to buy into this and let us do what needs to be done. So the final word I would have to say is, if somebody like me with no academic credentials in this field or expertise can do something like this, anybody can do this. You can just find some place to sort of fit yourself in and find a place where whatever skills you have can be of use. So that's all I have to say for now, and look forward to hearing the rest of the panel and the questions.
Well, Fran, that was totally fabulous, and your words were compact and eloquent, and just as we would expect. And the whole array of your work is really inspiring. Your last comments, I'll say, I think of, if you all can hear me, I think of Eben's call for us at the end of his video, which is to get involved in these conversations. Tax policy you mentioned, and so really for all of us to think about the political levers of power. And this is something we were sort of beginning to move towards in Vision for Vermont. I just put up, everybody, in the chat, both the Vision for Vermont website, and then a part of it that I'm certainly proud of and want to share briefly on the screen, which is has now disappeared. But let me see if I can get it here very quickly. Here it is. Hold on a second. I'll try this one more time, and then we're going to hear from Jack. Well, gosh, I'm not very good at this. So in the chat, you'll see we did podcasts. Students did podcasts with Fran's Vision for Vermont group. And the critical point I wanted to note is they interviewed teachers, they interviewed Black Vermonters, they interviewed farm workers as well as farmers. They interviewed folks who were homeless, several other categories. And it was to bring those voices, to put them, in your words, Fran, on an equal platform was powerful. We didn't solve it with Vision for Vermont. You'd be the first to acknowledge that. And so it is a work in progress, but I think the way your aspirations and the way you said it starts with justice and likewise maps so well to what we heard from Carolyn and then back to Jared. Before we go to some comments from our attendees, I'm going to do a little housekeeping and then we'll hear from Jack. The housekeeping is that it's now 6:11 and we are scheduled to go to 6:30. Most of our attendees, bless your hearts, have hung in there. We can go to, let's say, 6:40 if that's okay. And that would allow a little more time for those of you who are attendees and want to share points and comments to do so via the chat facility. I've been doing my best to make your comments public right away. But after we hear from my colleague, Jack Byrne, we'll then really open that up. And so there's already been a little bit of give and take there, and that'll be the way we'll communicate. And forgive us, this isn't the perfect medium of exchange, but again, we're conscious of needing to do this properly and with security these days. Jack Byrne is a fellow Middlebury person who's been at this for decades, and when I say this, it's trying to bring out the best of sustainability and the environment. As the Dean of Environmental Affairs and the person who runs our Sustainability Solutions Lab, he and his students are an inspiration. And Jack was one of a small number of people who led the charge for what's called Middlebury 2028, which is kind of a mini version, Jared, of what you're trying to do for the state, which is to set goals and make everybody stick to them unambiguously, including our board. So Jack, we'd love to hear from you for a few minutes as we set the stage for our attendees, and we're thankful that you're here.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's making me feel like we're doing right now what I had hoped we could continue to do with our Energy 2028 initiative, taking it from within the college and bringing it to and in relationship with the greater community outside of Middlebury. And we had a splendid forum planned to do that, and have people from the community. And about a week before that, everybody had to leave campus. So here we are doing it, and it's just a real pleasure to be doing this with a faculty member from the college. I'm a scholar in residence who's helping us look at how we think about these things in a much more interesting perspective, thinking about new ways of perceiving our work. Jared, your network across Vermont. Fran, your activism at the local level and your fluidity from the college and then back to the college with the community is just a really nice microcosm of one of the things that I think will help us get to this 2030 solution and living with the difficult situations that we have to on the way. Thank you, Carolyn. I'm not going to be long because I'm cognizant of the time. I want to make sure our participants have a chance. But I did want to kind of talk about a couple of things. I am looking at Middlebury's 12 years of journeying through carbon neutrality and then on to Energy 2028, which we adopted in 2019, as a case study and a learning place that could be really valuable for others in the state who are on the same journey with us. In a lot of ways, the college is like a town. It has buildings, it has a governance structure, it has forest land. I think a lot of the things that we have done to get to carbon neutrality and that we are attempting to do to get to Energy 2028 are similar to the kinds of things that a lot of other people are thinking about. And we have the benefit, I think, of having some pretty solid experience in doing it. We have the capability of taking some risks that others can't, and we learn a lot from that, and I think we have a lot to share there. And that with respect to kind of these priorities for getting to 2030, as Eben Goodstein and the initiative that he's kicked off, will require a lot of collaboration and cooperation and working together. And I think I'll mention some of the things we have done to get to carbon neutrality and to start to make our renewable energy sources 100% renewable and reduce consumption and so on. But the other thing that's happened at the college that I think is relevant and maybe valuable for others is that we had to get to consensus on these things. We have a pretty strong set of different views about that between our trustees, our students, our faculty, our staff. And I think the process by which we got to Energy 2028 is a really instructive one and that we can learn a lot from. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Energy 2028 sets 4 goals for us. One, to convert all of our energy sources to 100% renewable. Secondly, to reduce our consumption by 25% by 2028. Thirdly, to divest our endowment from fossil fuels. And then fourth, to integrate that into the educational mission of the college and make it an integral part of teaching, learning, research, internships, fellowships, community engagement of our students. And so I think, when you look at, I think of what we have done as we have localized our energy sources and our presence within our energy ecosystem. So we switched to biomass in 2006, and that took us significantly out of the global fossil fuel supply chain, which was very distant and remote. We didn't really know any of the people involved in that except the person who showed up with the truck and put number 6 fuel oil in our tank. Shifting to biomass meant we had to know the drivers of the chip trucks, we had to know the mill they were made at, we had to know where the wood came from and the people who were logging that and their practices. And it gave us a much more intimate connection and understanding of what it takes to heat the campus. We're in the process now of anaerobic digester project on the Goodrich farm, 7 miles from campus. That has, and it will give us a much more intimate connection with dairy farming in Vermont. We're much more sensitive to the kinds of challenges and issues that Vermont dairy families face right now as a result of it. We are working on a 5 megawatt solar project in Middlebury on South Street Extension on 28 acres of land. Now, that has created a significant amount of concern, and it has put us right in the middle of the local process of deciding if this is a good thing. And so far that has gone well, but it has really made us much more cognizant of the consequences of our choices around energy. And so I think what we hope to have happen through this process of Energy 2028 is that we can use Middlebury as a case study in a lot of different ways. How do you get to yes when there are significant differences of opinion around important issues? How do you move an institution's infrastructure from a fossil fuel basis to a renewable energy basis? One of the things that surprised me a bit about our board adopting this 4-part package was that they didn't blink at the 25% reduction in consumption goal. And I think that we thought that was going to be one of the more difficult challenges, because yeah, you can do stuff inside the building with the machinery and the equipment, but a lot of that was going to depend on people and how they use the building. And one of the things that we're learning a lot early into this process of Energy 2028 is that the way people use the building can make a huge difference in how much it consumes. And just to give you an example, scheduling. We have automatic systems that say, this building should turn on at 8 a.m. in the morning because people will show up, and it should go off at, in the case of the science building, 11 p.m. because by that time most of the lab work's done. Well, it turns out that most of the people are done by 7. And so scheduling back the unoccupants, turning the unoccupant mode of the building on at 7 p.m., if that's possible, depending on the programming, cuts the energy consumption by 12%, if you can do that regularly. So we're discovering a lot of those kinds of really soft solutions that don't take a lot of expense. They just take know-how and smarts, and then people willing to cooperate. And so I guess to just sum up, I would like to, in terms of priorities, I would like to see that we continue these kinds of discussions and collaborations and bringing this fundamental social justice component into it as we think about, how do we make better decisions about achieving these goals, whether they're for Middlebury as an institution or our municipal governments or our neighbors' houses, and to play a more active role, for the college to play a more active role as we had hoped to do with the Energy 2028 initiative going forward. So thank you to all of you for the really great ideas and inspiration in thinking about how we go beyond our COVID-19 world to our climate crisis world and manage both gracefully.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack. And again, I think we hear echoes of this wonderful theme that we have here, that the process is often the solution. I was very taken, as I'm sure many listening were, about the difference between the person who drives up and connects the hose with fossil fuel number 6 versus the interaction with human beings and all that they represent, and the complexities. So really a mini inspiration, I think. So I'm not sure where to go, so let me throw this out. We want to finish with 3 priorities. I think it's safe to say, going back, Jared, to your comments, that transportation is unambiguously a priority in the state. Now, getting there is 90% of the battle. Defining it is a good thing. So I'd like to just kind of, if it's okay, hold on to the big push around that as a category. And let me just see, starting from our panelists, give me a thumbs up if you just think a general category called transportation is a priority that emerges from this and related conversations. Am I onto something? All right. Then what I'm hearing is an even broader category, which each of you has mentioned, which is justice. Now, what does that mean? How does that get translated to legislation? I think I've heard from all of you that there are processes to which we need to commit. It starts in the classroom, I'll say, which center voices, which are genuine, which are humble, and so forth. For those of us in categories who have traditionally had power to stop and listen some more. How that translates to, knocking on doors in Montpelier needs to be worked out. But I think I'm safe to say that justice is another category to which we're all committed. It might be even the Uber category, but I'll just leave that thought there. If it's okay, then I'm going to keep an eye out on the chat now. And I think what I'm going to do, attendees, is open up. I'm going to try to see if I can do this. And I'm going to allow everybody now. I'm not sure I can, but what I'm going to try to do is let everybody who's attending send a note to all of us. If I figure that out, good. In the meantime, if you're listening, put up something on the chat and we panelists will see it. All right, so let's at least do that. And then I also, looks like I might have a nice Q&A from my friend Ellen Bett, so I'll get to that in a moment. I'm gonna look at a comment here from Esteban Arenas. If Vermont were to move to, and I'll put this up in a moment, if Vermont were to move from electrical vehicles, how can you think about accountability of the supply chains in mining from lithium? Excellent question. Where is the justice in that aspect when lithium mining is often not done with consent, nor payments are done to the local communities from where it is extracted? This is an excellent question, sir. So I'm gonna copy it, and then I'm gonna let any panelist unmute themselves if they want to address that very important question.
Well, you have us all stumped. It's something to think about that we don't think about enough.
Yeah.
And we just go to the dealership and buy a car. We don't think about what's in there. So of course you have to think about the very beginning of where these things are made all the way down to the end of what happens to them when they're done. I wonder if Esteban has any ideas about this.
Yeah, Esteban, if you want to offer those, that's a great idea. And then even we may be able to bring you in face to face. And that may be a bridge too far for me as the moderator, but let's hope for that. I will just say that I think, Esteban, generally what your comment makes us realize, and Jared, maybe going back to your perspective, is that, you know, as we heard from Dr. King in the letter from Birmingham Jail, it's a web of interconnectedness that is much more complex than we think. And it's challenging and sometimes discouraging, as this issue is. how do we balance the priorities of justice in terms of where lithium is mined with the priorities of justice in terms of moving away from CO2. Sometimes it seems like there are too many equations to try to solve. But maybe, Jared, if you could just weigh in quickly, how do you, from the state level, try to make sense of that connectedness and honor the kind of issue that Esteban is bringing to the floor here today?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Esteban. I think it's a fair and important question. One of the things that I think, I'm continually frustrated by, but it's the world we live in, is that there are no perfect energy solutions. There are costs in terms of carbon, in terms of justice, in terms of impacts on communities for every way of generating electricity, for every way of getting around. And so I think what we need to be able to do is first, be willing to have a nuanced conversation about the relative impacts of different choices, for whom, and for our climate pollution. And then say, if we can make a more just, a carbon better choice that's not perfect, how can we then still work to improve that through supply chains, through laws and regulations and accountability, and working with producers. I've been continually frustrated. I think it's fair and important to point out that the production of solar panels, the production of and siting of wind, the production of hydropower, the production of electric vehicle batteries, none of those have zero impact. But too often we have a conversation that focuses on those to a degree that ignores the justice implications, the climate pollution, and the costs of the fossil fueled status quo. We also see this in conversations about local wood heat. So I think we need to have all that on the table, but we need to have a nuanced conversation that compares it to the alternatives and says, what are the alternatives realistically? What is the climate impact of that? And what's the justice impact of that? And unfortunately, we're not often at a point where there is a perfect solution anywhere. But clearly, electric vehicles, when you do that type of analysis, are much less problematic from a climate perspective and from a justice perspective than continuing a fossil fueled transportation system.
There's a nice comment here, and if you could hear me typing, I hadn't muted myself, forgive me, but it's a good thought here from the Springfield UU Meeting House folks who've joined us. I put it in the chat. People need to demand openness about supply chains. This is exactly right. It's been done for chocolate, diamonds, products. Let's do it for batteries, for electric vehicles. I think that's a great thing. And so maybe that's something that could be part of this joint transportation and justice conversation. So Esteban, thank you for bringing that in. I'm gonna share a comment from an anonymous person who came to me from the Q&A medium, and I'm not quite sure how that differs from the chat, but nevertheless, I can repeat it here. One group that has yet to be mentioned is the indigenous groups that occupy the state, that occupy the state and have had an impact on the land. How can we include them in the conversation and use indigenous knowledge to try and not only combat climate change, but combat climate change as well? These communities hold information that may be extremely useful in understanding certain aspects of the environment that may be overlooked. Thank you for that comment. Carolyn, your face has lit up.
Could you see?
I think you have a thought on this, so please.
I do. First of all, I want to thank the person who made the comment, and I have to apologize for not being more explicit that's one of the things I was pointing to, and I should have actually said indigenous communities, because often that is exactly what happens, and not just in Vermont, but in a lot of places I've been, that the indigenous presence gets sidelined and is made invisible. So part of it, part of this for me is, what do the indigenous groups want to do? It's not it's less about reaching out. You know, I don't like this whole outreach, reaching out to other groups, because it assumes a kind of power dynamic that I think is really, again, perpetuates this idea that it's reaching out to someone like they need help, when they may have a lot, like you said, a lot of information already out there. So I'd be curious about what the Indigenous communities think about in terms of what they're doing already, what their concerns are. Part of what I understand is how those of us like myself who are not Indigenous, how we build a relationship of trust. So now when we start talking about Indigenous communities, we're talking about at least 400, 500 years of all the land was stolen. And we haven't, some would say, actually really ever addressed that, you know? And so really starting to think about how do you build trust with a community that has a long memory, right, of what it means to be who they are on the land. And, you know, generally speaking, have a very different way to frame the conversation, how they understand energy, how they understand themselves as part of nature. Just, there's so many different pieces to that conversation. So part of it for me is just wondering how they want to define themselves first. And do they want to share that information? Because oftentimes people don't want to share information if there's no trust there. How often have we taken that information and not attributed it to anyone but ourselves?
Yeah.
Right? So what does that look like?
Yeah. I'm humbled by the question, and like you, Carolyn, not as an Indigenous person, I'm still going to offer a couple of thoughts, if I may. And this begins with the kind of civic activity and the institutional activity that we saw at Middlebury too. Those of us who are not Indigenous must listen deeply. There's no question. And I think the thing that we can do in Vermont now is to do that effectively and efficiently. The Abenaki leaders are doing extraordinary work. Chief Don Stevens is overburdened with requests, and that's because he's so extraordinary. And I'll say that Middlebury College is in the midst of going just beyond the land acknowledgements and really figuring out how to act in the ways that, Carolyn, your comments earlier suggested. So a start, pre-COVID anyway, was to have a 2-week language program in the language, the Abenaki language. And then again, I will note that Vision for Vermont, the group that Fran so ably led with others, we not only brought in an Indigenous leader at our last gathering and made her one of the leading voices, but we did our best to have this conversation. So some of these injustices are centuries long, and it is the Indigenous folks themselves who understand that all too well. And those of us who are not must honor healing and listen. So I'm thankful, knowing that our time is not limitless tonight, to that person's comment. And I think that's about as high a priority as we have. Thank you. I'm going to take, if I can, the organizer's prerogative and exercise power in a way that is going to make me feel very good. And that's to bring in my friend Alan Betts, and I'm going to do that now. I need to upgrade him technically, and he's about to come in. And for those of you who know Alan, he's been pursuing a life of climate science for decades, based down in Pittsford, and is a unique voice in this state to offer thoughts on the science and making sense of it. There is Alan. Hi, my friend. And so I think I may have to unmute you. Yeah, there we go.
Am I muted or unmuted?
No, you are delightfully unmuted now.
Good.
And Alan, if we can benefit, this is kind of like when a relief pitcher comes in the 10th inning and wins the game. Well, maybe that metaphor is too much.
I understand.
We're delighted to have you with us, Alan.
Well, I'm not going to talk about what you asked. I've been looking at the COVID crisis and thinking about what it really means for the collapse of our global capitalist economy. And we really have to face that the issues that we are seeing now, the justice issues, the exploitation of people, the pushing off costs for the future, the exploitation of the planet, all those aspects of our global capitalist system have to be faced, even if we live here in America. So I'm just going to go in a few minutes down that. We have a system which has no moral guiding principles. It simply demands growth and profit. Has no consideration for resilience, no consideration for long-term stability, no consideration for justice, for working people, for anybody, for the people on the other side of the world, and certainly no consideration of justice for life on Earth. It was powered by fossil fuel, right? Most people don't recognize we controlled the price of fossil fuel at $3 a barrel in the post-war era until OPEC rebelled. That it's utterly incompatible without the control of fossil fuel, and capitalism as it's functioned is incompatible with a livable Earth. And we refuse to face it because it's the free market system that we live with. We've given it the right to externalize all the adverse impacts. It doesn't have to pay for anything, the current oppression of people, the catastrophic effects of climate change. But it continues because it's profitable and because $1 trillion can buy politicians and it can buy our media. And it's buying them all the time. So we're seeing here in the COVID system something that it can't deal with. And you can see the globalization of everything, which has meant now broken supply chains on all sorts of things, came out of the fact that we pushed everything everywhere for where we could make it cheapest, where we could exploit people most efficiently. And we have to face it. We cannot have justice unless we confront the corruption of the system that we have bought into and make it pay all the costs. That's the entry point for it, is to make it pay for the costs. Just as it doesn't pay any of the costs for the future climate change, doesn't pay any costs for exploiting people, doesn't pay any of the current costs. There are so many other things that could kick us like COVID. A single solar flare hitting the Earth will wipe out our communications networks. And climate change downstream, yes, has lots of things. We have to ask, what do we need for long-term resilience and stability for humanity and for the Earth? The relocalization you have discussed, but we have to reinvent the economic system in this situation and as we go down by paying all the costs. We can't just externalize them and expect our kids, the Earth, and people, yes, the lithium batteries, everybody around the world to play them for us so we can live a little bit more cheaply in a more luxurious thing. It's utterly unjust. I could go on, but that's my, my next column in the Herald will be on this theme in a few weeks.
Thank you, Alan, so much. And so many of us cherish your voice and will look for that in the Herald. And it's another reason to buy local papers.
And by the way, you hit it out of the park.
Well, I'll just say one more thing. Now is the perfect time to add a fossil carbon tax when the price of oil is low, but nobody's discussing it. Nobody in the public would notice, but the oil people want a subsidy so that they can go on extracting and developing new oil industries from the fracking industry. No, we should be pushing for a tax on oil now when no one would notice it.
Well put. So that is so much to think about and chew on, and it is essential. And again, I will go back, as I mentioned earlier, to a great colleague we have, Professor Daniel Suarez, who's really having us think about the systems that you have pointed out with the same kind of passion and so forth. So thank you again, Alan. I am kind of bummed out that we are now at the end because it's 40. Well, I'm not too bummed out because I'm hungry. but I'm delighted that we've had this conversation. I want to honor Eben's request, and so I'm not quite sure how to do this. And so maybe we'll just, among the moderators, have you answer. And then let me invite everybody who's listening to not only keep throwing things on the chat. You may not be able to see them go out there, but we'll make sure they get out there to everyone. We'll have a follow-up email to you all. And then feel free to send an email to me, jisham@middlebury.edu. It was in your invitation on that landing page. Anything else you want to raise. And we'll keep this forum alive at least through one more email thread, and then maybe perhaps some other ways that Vermonters can keep talking. With that said, why don't we start in the direction with this panelist in the same order. Jared will go, and then Carolyn, Fran, Jack, quickly. And just, if you can, in the least amount of words possible, what are your 3 priorities? And don't feel you have to detail them, but let's kind of tally them, see if there's a bit of consensus, and then it's from that Eben will be able to collect, in a way, data that allows us to think where all the states are. So Jared, would you want to start that as we finish up?
Sure, thanks, John. Really, there's 2 for me, and one is recognizing that, technology and markets are driven by policy and regulations. And until we have a comprehensive policy and regulatory framework that leads us in the direction of ending fossil fuel use and getting away from fossil fueled equipment, we're not going to be able to make the progress that we need. So it's a comprehensive, economy-wide policy and regulatory framework that deals with the magnitude of the climate crisis. And there's lots of ways to do that. The second, which is deeply related to that, is making sure there's lots of good policy and regulatory and policy frameworks out there. Making sure that there is an equity and a justice focus so that the benefits of that transition and the costs of that transition, we are doing that in a progressive, equity-focused way so that the folks who have contributed the least to the problem are not asked to bear a cost, and that we can see real benefits to folks who have for too long not been able to participate and enjoy the benefits of kind of our energy and economic system. So really comprehensive policy framework that's economy-wide, centering equity and justice in the design of those policies.
Excellent. I'm going to try to write this all in the chat. And as we do so, Carolyn, can you jump in, please?
I can, sorry. Yes, so I was just writing, the process is solution, right? That justice is embedded. So very, very simply said, it's not the extra thing, it's the integrated thing. And we have to work out what it is. And there's more I can say about that, but I'll leave that alone. But I'm really, because I'm so moved by Alan Betz's contribution. And it went back to, for me, I wanted to connect it to also the conversation with Jared and the person participating who brought it up about the lithium question, and that we start look at supply chains and understanding there's a larger context that we are working in relation to. So I'm interested in for myself, as well as others, self-education, not just about climate change, but climate change that is linked to global capitalism, that the role of complicity and our own honesty about, there doesn't seem to be there's nothing perfect here, right? We've created this world that is so complicated and messy. We've taken such advantage of it in multiple ways, right? I don't see that we can be clean, to play on a pun there, but we can be clean in it, but we can be true and honest about it. And so what does that look like? How do we develop that language? How do we develop that ability, that practice of of saying these things, so it shows up in policy and legislation and curriculum and all the ways that we want to move forward to do things differently, that revolutionary change thing that I mentioned earlier. That.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning education there. That is certainly our role. Awesome. Fran.
Well, I had some different things before this, 3 things before this panel started, but now I've changed. So we didn't talk much about the Global Warming Solutions Act and the other climate legislation that's currently stalled in the legislature, but I really think that that needs to be a priority, because if we don't have the policies, we can't change anything practical, because we won't have any measurable goals. The goals right now are just aspirational. We need to have fixed goals, and we need to meet them if we're going to do anything by 2030. Then again, use our tax structure to move towards climate solutions with fairness for all. Everybody contributing to the best of their abilities. And I really liked what Alan was saying. I mean, I've been saying that for weeks now about this pandemic, is that it just shows that the shallowness and the greed and the corruption of our economic system of capitalism, and how it's been so ruthless. So this just shows what Alan was saying exactly. Okay, so and number 3, I'm so glad that someone brought up, we haven't mentioned Indigenous people, and we need to look to our Indigenous people and also other people in Vermont who haven't been heard so far. What are their concerns? What ideas do they have? They might have ideas that are completely different that would be helpful. So Global Warming Solutions Act, our tax structure, and looking to those people whose voices haven't been heard yet.
John, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Fran, for your eloquent and succinct summary there. Jack, what are your thoughts?
Echo Alan again, truth to power, see it the way it is, work it through the pocketbook, I think really important. I think we're fortunate to be Vermonters because we actually have a very functional government willing to compromise and work together to achieve the greater good. I think we live in a time where that is a diminishing commodity, and I think we need to resist the temptation to get sucked into the polarized discussion about all of these issues, but to really stay in the gray, nuanced area and really try to find our way through civility, clarity, and an eye toward the greater good. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Alan, since you have joined our party and been appreciated so much, do you have a final thought or two for prioritizing?
No, I don't.
Okay. Thank you so much for those comments. I want to thank 2 colleagues before a final comment or two, one of whose name you see here, Ava Morgan, who is a first year at Middlebury and who's volunteered for Eben's group on a part of a national set of volunteers, Solve Climate by 2030. It is fair to say that none of this would have happened well without Ava, and everything that didn't go well, I take full responsibility for, by the way. Janet Wiseman, who also has been kind of in the attendee group to keep an eye on how this looks from the attendee perspective, has been wonderfully helpful, as she always is, with efforts out of the Franklin Environmental Center at Hillcrest. So Janet, I know you can hear this, and we're clapping for you. And you can see us too.
Thank you, Ava.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you, Ava and Janet. I want to finish with something that we all know to be true. I don't think we talk about enough. Years ago, I was talking about the social capital and how it's such a great idea for affecting change. And a scholar who had a bit more of a cynical eye, a guy from Columbia, Patrick Heller, he said, here's the 3 things you need to know about social capital. Really, these things work because of power, power, and power. And I don't mean electric power. We need political power. And by saying we, I mean the folks who have a certain sensibility that's quite inclusive, indeed, but it is political power is where the rubber meets the road. And Jack, I think that's a good point about Vermont. It's doable. After all, we all know a story of a certain mayor who was a Democratic socialist who became the mayor after many, many years of trying. And that changed the city. And without advocating him necessarily for 2020, he illustrates that you have to grapple with and seize power. So many of the reasons we are in the situation we are with COVID and climate is because a certain group of folks, I'm going to be very blunt, have power who don't see the world this way. They don't see a world in an inclusive way, in a holistic way, in a loving way, who would never acknowledge the truths that we are touching on in all humility as we try. So power is essential. And let's face that truth and maybe act on it. As Eben said, he hopes that all of us can get involved in campaigns that can tilt the scales towards justice. So I'm going to finish with that and thank everybody here. This has been awesome. And thanks to Janet Wiseman, by the way, it has been recorded. So folks will be able to see it far and wide. I share my gratitude to everybody. So thank you so much. See you all soon, I hope.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.